So one of the big issues in the West is Islam is generally viewed as a very different entity than Christianity or Judaism or any other Abrahamic religions. And generally that's not true. The issue is that the percentage of people that are conservative, that take biblical inerrancy is much higher. So if you, in the West or like in the US, if Ken Ham was the majority of everybody, the situation we would have would be very different. So it's largely a reflection of the population and the amount of people that understand the Enlightenment values. So I'm going to cover some historical facts about Muhammad and his depiction and why it's currently an issue. So if you look at most religions, they have an element where they want to establish supremacy of their own deity over other deities. And if you talk about early Persian god Ahura Mazda, it was similarly one of the first monotheistic religions. And they had periods where they allowed depiction of Ahura Mazda, and they had periods where they didn't. So it varied depending upon the political climate, upon how pluralistic the society was. If you look at Judaism, they had similar things where graven images were not allowed. That's the second commandment. Over time, that changed, and even it went back and forth over the centuries. And there's a 3rd century relief that was found that covers the Exodus. Similarly, in Islam, you've had issues where it went back and forth over time. If you look at early Islam, it was based in a period where idolatry was common, and Muhammad was fighting against the current climate, which was in Makkah. You had hundreds of idols that people worship, and it was a trading center, and he was trying to abolish that. So what unites the three faiths is Abraham, and in Islam, Abraham is celebrated as the destroyer of idols. And Muhammad was trying to fit that mold, and when he conquered Makkah, he similarly went in and destroyed hundreds of idols, and that's regarded as one of the great victories. So initially, pluralism wasn't a part of it. It was we're right and everybody else will suffer. But again, like as any faith or any empire grows, you have to accommodate opposing views. Things change as you encounter other cultures. So as Islam expanded to other areas, be it Turkey, be it South Asia, the flavor changed. This is from Islamic scripture itself, which strictly prohibits images of any kind. There are various reasons. The primary one is, in Islam, if you're drawing an image, the concern is you'll start worshiping that image, similar to the golden calf. So, as I was saying, within Judaism, you had people that, even in early ages, did draw images, people that were against drawing images. Similarly, within Islam, there are various strains that have existed throughout time. There are various schools of thought. Some disallow sculpture, some disallow imagery, some are okay with both. So that's a modern doll. This is from like 2 years ago. And faces are prohibited according to certain sects. So therefore, the doll cannot have a face. And this was marketed in England. So going back 1,000 years, you can see imagery being drawn of Muhammad, with face, with everything. And today, you cannot find this in the same areas. You would not be able to reproduce these images. That's a vision of hell, with Muhammad observing people being tortured. If you look at this image, the face of Muhammad is blurred out, similar to the doll. So there are religious edicts that you can draw out, have graven images, as long as they don't represent a person or represent an actual life. So one of the ways they do it is to hide faces. So this is one that I find particularly amusing. So generally photography is prohibited, imagery is prohibited. There have been some scholars that have said digital imagery is fine because it's not permanent. So you can delete it, it goes away. There have been similar things where some conservative strains don't allow television. Others view it with the same edict that it's a passing image. You can't really worship a passing image, so therefore it's all good. A cousin of mine that was very conservative, was against imagery, and when she had kids, she went on in this direction. It's digital imagery, it doesn't count. So, like everybody else, like every other faith or every other community, people are relatively malleable depending upon their own circumstances. The issue is we need to create those circumstances where they feel like they can make their own choice and they're not bound by these strict scriptures. And you see that as you move from country to country. The more tightly intermeshed the government is with religion, the harder you have this problem, like in Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, Western books are imported, faces are blacked out. In comparison, in Turkey, it's far more European. If you look at the beliefs, you probably read about the Pew survey that was talking about attitudes within Muslim countries. They also reflect that. So in North Africa, somewhere around 90% of people believe that the Quran is literally true, and therefore their version of Islam is far more austere. In comparison, in the US, it's closer to 50%. This was a movie that was made in 1976. It was about Muhammad. And in order to avoid, and it was done by a Muslim. And in order to avoid criticism and a backlash, they never showed Muhammad in the movie. So it was images of people talking to him. Despite that, the director of the movie was killed in a suicide bombing. So going back to the original theme was that we don't want people worshiping anything else besides God, and therefore imagery is strictly prohibited. You have devotional shrines that exist throughout the Muslim world for saints, and similar to Catholics to a great extent. Strictly speaking, those aren't appreciated, but they existed in Saudi Arabia, they existed in pretty much every single Muslim country. And our current issue. So if you notice the images that I was going through before, all of them were from Persia, from Uzbekistan, from Turkey. Like, there are very few, if any, I wasn't able to find any image that is from Arabia itself. And over the past century, you've had a rise in the power of the Arab state, primarily Saudi Arabia and surrounding countries. And as a result, they've been able to export their values. So a lot of countries that used to be more pluralistic, that were willing to accept a less austere version, are not doing that anymore. So in Saudi Arabia, about 200 years ago, there was somebody named Abdul Wahab who basically took over the peninsula and implemented his vision of Islam. And he started destroying shrines, and to the extent that he destroyed Muhammad's wife's shrine, he leveled a cemetery where all of Muhammad's companions were, and he was trying to destroy the grave of Muhammad himself, because people go there for devotional reasons. And only at that point, the Ottoman Empire invaded to prevent that from happening. And the Saudi state is a continuation of that, and they're actually trying to do that now. There's a plan where they plan to exhume Muhammad's body and bury it in an unmarked grave. So a lot of what's stemming out is from an Arab, particularly Wahhabi interpretation of Islam that they're pushing onto other people. So if you look at a parallel to the West, if you have a state that is extremely conservative and is the richest state in the area, and people actually believe that they have moral authority, chances of them being able to push their vision onto other countries, other cultures is far higher. And if you talk to anybody from any of the countries, be it Indonesia, Pakistan, Turkey, there's a rise of conservatism, and it's largely being fueled by oil money. Any questions?
Texas. Good point.
Okay. Yeah, someone give it light. Yeah, several questions. Yeah.
Okay, friends, here's how we're going to do the questions. I know he's going to be popular and we'll have lots of them. I'll raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone around, and please ask your question quickly so that we can get as many in as possible. Thank you.
You said that books that are imported have their faces blacked out.
Yeah.
There's like some guy with a job whose job is just to
Yes.
black out faces. Like
There's an entire government department to take care of that.
Really?
Yes.
Well, how about things like passport photos and visa photos? Surely they're allowed, are they not?
Yeah, they are.
I'm a bit confused about the depictions of the prophet that caused such chaos. If I were to draw a stick figure without labeling it, it would be okay. But if I labeled it with the name of the prophet, that would be considered naming the prophet?
To a certain extent, yes. The issue isn't that. The issue is it's viewed as blasphemy. The imagery isn't the real issue. So as I showed, there are lots of images that are positive that exist throughout Muslim history, and there hasn't been a widespread attempt to destroy them. The issue is when we're drawing cartoons in the West, they're perceived as challenging Muhammad's honor, and anybody that does that is automatically liable to be punished.
I was wondering, here in the United States, we had many years ago some in the Christian religious community that were using verses from the Bible to basically justify maltreatment of African Americans, and then the leaders, the more moderate leaders, stood up and said, no, that's wrong. I was wondering, in your view, why is it we're not seeing a little bit more of that from more moderate imams within Islam standing up and saying, no, this very strict, very radical interpretation is incorrect?
So one of the things is that in the West you have a secular tradition, you have enlightenment values, you have freedom of expression, which doesn't really exist. So people that have stood up in Muslim countries have often been killed. So it's very hard to actually achieve that. You have reformists in every single Muslim country, both in the West and in the East. In Pakistan, there's a physicist that's very popular, Professor Hudbo. He's trying to educate people about scientific values and the importance of enlightenment values. There have been multiple attempts to kill him. One of his neighbors was murdered. There's another governor of Pakistan that was murdered simply for speaking out against blasphemy laws. And this is the governor of the largest state. So it's very hard for somebody to actually be able to speak up when the pressure against them is so high. One other issue is that in the West, we often, when we're talking about Muslim communities, like you mentioned, why aren't imams speaking up? It shouldn't be about imams. If you're talking about America in general, are you going to go to the churches and ask them to speak up about issues related to America? No. You need secular, enlightened, taught leaders, and those are what we should be encouraging, and they exist everywhere. You've probably heard of Irshad Manji in Canada, in Majid Awaz in the UK. Like, there are many, many people out there that are trying to affect these change, but for whatever reason, we in the West are focused on religious leaders instead of taught leaders.
You spoke of monotheism versus pluralism as, I guess, like idols, and were like competing religions. Everyone had their own little thing going on, and the dominionists just took over and squelched all that. That's supposed to be a good thing, I guess.
From their perspective, yes.
Point,
yeah.
I suppose.
So from their perspective, that's one of the high tide that they were able to destroy any opposing force, any opposing god. From their perspective, all of these gods were false gods, and their God is the right God, so the more retribution, the better.
So, Muhammad, are you taking your life in your hands by even showing this slideshow?
I hope not.
Y'all, I know there's lots of questions, but we want to make sure we have enough time for Margaret, and we'll be able to have a conversation with Muhammad later. So thank y'all very much.
Thank you.